Digital audio health by Syntrek.
Welcome to the Rhonda Grant Show with your host, Rhonda Grant. If you believe that there is more to life than what you see right now, and you want to find out more, listen in as her guests share their journey and their extraordinary experiences. Now, here is your host, Rhonda Grant.
Welcome to the Rhonda Grant Show. Sometimes the universe has a way of placing people or obstacles in your path to help guide and direct you on your mission. Listen in as we discover the path my guest has traveled. Has he been inspired by a calling, crafted his journey, or a bit of both? I invite you to embrace the conversations and to use them to help you to recognize if this is happening in your life. Our guest today is Dr. Howard Eisenberg. He is a medical doctor with additional postgraduate training in both psychology and psychiatry. He has been a lecturer in parapsychology at the University of Toronto and an associate professor of medicine at the University of Vermont. He is also the CEO of the international consultancy Syntrek Inc. On a more personal level, he has been on a personal lifelong quest to discover the true nature of reality. He was awarded the first postgraduate degree in Canada at McGill University, parapsychological research on telepathy. He then pioneered the instruction of parapsychology as a regular credit course at the University of Toronto. Almost half a century ago, he authored his first trailblazing book, Inner Spaces, Parapsychological Explorations of the Mind. This new book, Dream It to Do It, is a culmination of his successful quest to learn how reality works. Welcome to the Rhonda Grant Show. Howard, how are you today?
Rhonda. Thank you, Rhonda. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're welcome. Oh, it's such a pleasure for me to be interviewing you. I'm in love with your new book, Dream It to Do It. The Science of Magic is just incredible. I'm actually read it, but I also bought the audio, and I really enjoyed the audio as well.
I think they complement each other really well. Like one's maybe more intellectual, the book itself, same material, but the way you receive it with the audio, it's experiential in a different way. So I think the ideal is actually both versions.
The audio is very intimate. I've really enjoyed it, and good. I'm going to listen to it again too. So it was wonderful. So my question is, what age were you when you started to remember that you had special abilities?
I don't have a specific age. It's more, an age band, around 11 or so. Mm-hmm. I started having a different awareness than my family, than my peers.
Okay.
Not something at the time I was putting in words, but it was an awareness of what I would now call a glimpse of the spaciousness of consciousness. I was aware of an inner depth that no one had talked about, and I had no one to talk about to it. I just was experiencing it. And also a sense of the world being partly mysterious, but also not as it necessarily seems on the surface. Again, a very rudimentary sense of that when I was around 11, I repeat. And also became more aware of my intellectual gifts around that age. I was actually a very mediocre student until approximately grade 5 elementary or so, around that time. Just passing, but barely, because I was distracted. I wasn't present. I was somewhere else, so to speak. And I had a teacher in grade 5 who recognized the potential intellectually, and he drew me out, and my grades went to the highest level they could possibly go without my really burning sort of midnight oil. And school honored that achievement by giving me a special award at graduation, even though it wasn't my graduation. I was just in grade 5, for the most improved student in the school. So it was on both levels, the subjective sense of the spaciousness, and also intellectually suddenly starting to fire in all cylinders in a much sharper way.
And yeah, so what was interfering with your learning was your preoccupation of lots of other things going on, energy-wise, I would imagine. Receiving different energies, or
I don't even know if I could, put it in those words. I'll just say I wasn't fully present in the outside world. No one would have known that. It wasn't that I was
I know,
or anything of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
But you asked the question, like when I had that awareness.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't in a sense of physical energy. It's very hard to put in words. They say the mystical experience is ineffable. You can't put it in words. And one of the challenges in my book was to take the experiences of the mystics and some people with meditation, psychedelics, and various other ways that there's alteration of consciousness, and find a way using language to explain it in such a way that actually isn't so intellectual, that becomes a little more experiential.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to put it in words explicitly, because the words, like we say, the map is not the territory. So the word is more like a symbol towards something. The word itself has no meaning in itself.
I understand what you're saying. And so I think, is it that you're more in touch with your soul and your soul's mission or journey? And a little bit more, you seem to be a little bit more serious about life during that time than other children tended to be?
At around age 12, again, I'm just ballparking. It's a long time
Yeah,
ago.
sure. Yeah, it's a long time ago.
I'm just shy of 76, so it's a long time ago.
But
I remember accompanying my mother to a supermarket store to buy groceries. And by the aisles, as they still do, they would have magazines and displays. And at the time, they had a series of books being advertised on the Bible. And they were offering the first volume, I think, for 99 cents, something like that.
Yeah, I remember stuff like that.
I asked my mother to buy it for me. And it had an unusual impact on me. Again, I went somewhere else with it. And that was the first intimation, as I look back on it now, of a sense of a calling. It was so nascent. It was so, just a flicker back then. But something happened.
Something happened.
Unexpected. It wasn't like reading a regular book.
Well, I find it fascinating, and and I early on also felt these types of abilities. And one of the questions that I've asked people, and actually I'd like to ask you, is when did you know you were you? When did you have a recognition of self? And the reason I ask, go ahead.
Probably again around that age you first, asked when I was awareness around 11. So I was experiencing a sense of agency, that I wasn't just passively in the world to go through the motions of various things and eventually, become mature and so on. It was a very different sense. And that's partly why academically it just shot up incredibly. Right.
At that time. Yes. Because when I've asked people and they say, well, I've always been me, and I was, and I remember when I came into being and I realized I was me, and I realized that there was a space around me as well, not only in front of me, but behind me, and being able to observe myself. And I just felt different than other people. I really did, because of that.
I can relate to that.
Pardon?
I can relate to that.
You can relate to that, yeah. So what inspired you to dig deeper into the parapsychology world?
Again, back to that early age, around 11 to 12, I was being really curious to understand more fully the world, reality, in a much deeper sense, obviously, than my peers at such a young age. And I became very interested in just reading whatever I could about science, about history, about religion, very precociously on my own. And in my early teens, I discovered bookstores, which back then were paperback bookstores, so they were very inexpensive and accessible. and that became the kind of the joy of my life, to go to the bookstore and get books.
Mhm.
So I would read on everything, including, by the way, science fiction, which partly inspired me at the time. It
Yes.
was around the time when I was reading about things that were just out of people's imagination as fiction writers, not as scientists, when things were starting to happen in the outside world, our conventional world, if you want to call it that way,
Mhm.
that were sort of manifesting things that were just speculative, imagination in these science fiction books, like, for example, outer space, the Sputniks were launched.
Mhm.
So as I pursued more deeply various aspects, both of science fiction and of the various sciences, and world again studies on anthropology, religion at a very young age, I started to become also aware that there was this, at least in science fiction literature to begin with, references to things like teleportation, time travel. And I
Right.
started to become curious. Like, some of the things were happening in outer space, which were just speculative fiction when they were written. I was wondering if that also may be something that has reality to it. And so I started to look for books that might talk seriously about such things. Discovered the work of J.B. Rhine, who was the
Yes.
pioneering parapsychologist in the US and in some ways internationally, as looking at it as a science.
Mhm.
Eventually met him, by the way. I went down to Durham, North
Wonderful.
Carolina, and met him personally
Wonderful.
on in my early 20s. But coming back to that, so as I started reading and that there was some serious research going on this, I became curious too, back to personal awareness. Can
Mhm.
I do something with this intentionally? I mean, as opposed to it just, happening spontaneously sometimes.
Yeah.
Can I do it intentionally? And so I, at a very young age, again, we're talking middle teens almost, I thought of doing some experiments on my own. I didn't know anyone to
Okay.
talk to about this at that point.
Right. Yeah,
So,
exactly.
and my first experiments that I remember were sitting on the back of streetcars, the very back, as far back as I could go,
Right.
and focusing my intention on somebody at the very front of the streetcar who was sitting down with their back to me.
Mhm.
And the experiment was to see if, when I concentrated on them,
Yeah.
could I cause them to both feel
Mhm.
something, and to such a degree that they would turn around and look directly at me, not around the streetcar, but directly at me. And right away,
Mhm.
that was the test. So it
Wow.
wasn't just a random thing.
Mhm.
And that worked. And then I tried to make it harder, like thinking again scientifically when I was a kid.
Yes.
And I only would choose people who were reading a book or a magazine. So they already were
Mhm.
absorbed with something. It would have worked even in that situation. And it did. And then I raised the condition one step further and only would take people who were in conversation with each other at the front of the vehicle, thinking again it's even less likely they would be aware of, some subtle thing in the background.
Right.
It still
Yes.
worked. So that was kind of the first experiment I remember doing. I've done others since, obviously. But that's, I think, the first one around my mid-teens that way.
I love that experiment. And I've played with that too.
Mhm.
And it's amazing. You feel like you have a secret or a special power that you're able to do that, and those people don't realize. Something that happened to me yesterday morning, I was in Ottawa,
Mhm.
and I was with my sister,
Mhm.
and it was in the morning, and we were just chatting and things like that, and all of a sudden I started putting my boots on,
Mhm.
and as soon as I put my boots on, the fire alarm went.
Mhm.
So that is a knowing something that may happen in the future, but it's also recognizing what you're doing and what happens after you've done what you've done, and putting those two things together. Like, how was it? Was there a part of me that knew that the fire alarm was going to sound in this hotel that we were in?
Mhm.
And I put my boots on ahead of time.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I become so curious about that.
Mhm.
So very curious. And so this leads me into precognition
Mhm.
and precognitive dreaming.
Mhm.
So how would you like to speak about that? I'd like to know your views on that.
Well, first, I think there's very strong scientific proof that,
Yes.
first, that precognition does exist.
Mhm.
In some people, it doesn't mean everyone who says they have
No.
abilities is gifted as he does.
Mhm.
But in laboratory studies, which are extremely well controlled with replications,
Mhm.
we have proven the existence of precognition, as we call it in parapsychology, or the public would refer to as premonitions.
Oh, premonitions, yes.
But it's also something that I'm personally familiar with in terms of experiencing it. And for me, it's been not always, but relatively painful, especially these last several years,
Right.
because I've foreseen so much of the darkness that's happening, and it still is going to happen. And it's a horribly painful experience to see awful things and not be able to do anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
In my case, I don't have a choice of this type of awareness,
Right.
but I do have a choice in what I do with it,
Okay.
which is not easy.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to be overwhelmed by this and get into a sense of despair, depression.
Mm-hmm.
What's the use? Or throw caution to the wind and just live hedonistically for a short period of time, as many humans are doing right now, crazily,
Right.
but they are.
Right.
But for me, what I decided I had to do, and I felt this is where the calling comes into it in this case, I felt I have to share what I have learned, not just I'll call them the existential threats, which are multiple that we're facing right now in our world,
Mm-hmm.
but what I've learned about how reality works.
Yes.
And realized just recently, a few years ago, that really had been my life quest to understand reality, and secondly, to share that with others, before obviously in a very elementary form. So for example, I've worked still as a medical psychotherapist.
Mm-hmm.
I've worked as a high-level corporate consultant and trainer, executive coach. So I've written a previous book, half century ago, Inner
Yes.
Spaces, Parapsychological Expression of the Mind. I had my own CBC national radio series, Odyssey. So I've done many different
Okay.
things, but the common denominator underlying all that has been educating, sharing information, increasing
Yes.
people's awareness. However, this is a different level now, because I never was concerned so much with existential threats as
Mm-hmm.
I see them now. And I don't see the humanity broadly rising in any way to the challenge. I see a number of things happening. I see mass emotional dysregulation, people
Mm-hmm.
losing it, to put it in simpler terms.
Mm-hmm.
Some people, as I say, just living for the moment because they don't feel there's a future.
Mm-hmm.
Other people just selfishly grabbing what they can from others in various ways. No constructive way of coming together to collaborate, which is the key thing we need to do, because we've all been competing with each other in various ways, or enemies with each other,
Right.
and to go back and have a visionary sense
Mm-hmm.
of the map forward, instead of just downhill and be consumed by all this darkness, and a need for inspired leadership and new leadership, not professional politicians, not
Mm-hmm.
people who have strong egos and want other people to be impressed by them or have power over others or become
Right.
more wealthy. We don't want that type of person at this point. They're totally the wrong ones for us. We need people who have an inspired sense of mission, and those are people generally who shied away from politics.
Yes.
That's what we need right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we need different types of leaders. There's been a whole movement in conscious awareness in the last few years. And I think that it's going to continue to develop. And the more we talk about this type of thing, the more podcasts that are done on it,
Mm-hmm.
the more people have the opportunity to know that if they have these feelings, they found out that it is a genetic component to it. There is a genetic component to it. Is it may give them permission to feel and recognize what they feel, and it's okay to feel that way. They don't have to be afraid of those feelings, and to start talking to other people about it, because there's been a whole movement of conscious awareness. And do you want to speak to our audience about conscious awareness? Like, what does that mean? Because people say some people are unconscious, and I know I've been unconscious sometimes in my life, but I don't mean unconscious. I fell, hit my head, and now I'm unconscious. I mean, not getting it, not having the
Mhm.
awareness of everything that's going around you, and
Mhm.
only having sort of tunnel vision. I mean, there's still people like that, but can you just speak to conscious awareness?
Well, my book is a combination of science
Mm-hmm.
and logical connections of the information that I've discovered. So if people read it sequentially, to come
Mm-hmm.
back to your question, it, I hope, leads them into that path of understanding and experiencing
Right.
consciousness in a whole different way. My first chapter, as you may recall, is things are not as they seem.
I know
Which is
they're
fundamental,
not. That's
but
right.
the second chapter is the only thing you can absolutely know. Back to your question on consciousness. So I start uh, trying to ask questions to help people reflexively start already at the very beginning of the book, increase that awareness, not because I say anything. It's not a question of believing me or not, but just consider
Mm-hmm.
those, historical record, consider this scientific development, just reflect on this question. I mean, it just comes to them if they're open to it, in that sense. One way of defining consciousness itself, it's awareness
Mm-hmm.
of being aware.
Right.
And
Mm-hmm.
that itself is basic. But there are different levels of consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
many different levels, and many different levels of, I could say, of associated what we call reality, or dimensions of reality, if you like.
Okay.
It's definitely not just all horizontal. We're like
Mm-hmm.
the tips of the iceberg of, the greater reality around us. And we live in a world right now which is extremely materialistic. It's extremely about the things out there,
Mm-hmm.
and also in terms of our psychological development, most of us are very much into ego, in terms of, what can we, first of all, personally do or obtain for our just basic, protection, survival. But it's not satisfied with that, because ego wants more, just like cancer
Mm-hmm.
wants more in the body. So
Yeah.
how do I get more than my neighbor? Uh, how do I get, people to work for me?
Mm-hmm.
How do I find a way of getting something somebody else has that I want? So that's what ego does, and it's running rampant right now. So that combination of materialism, the world out there, and being stuck in our ego, which is generally emotionally motivated,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to intellectual awareness or enlightenment, quite the opposite, are the challenges we have right now. I've been interested, as I said to you, from an early age, back as we went to adolescence earlier,
Mm-hmm.
in a different type of awareness. And then my first experience, I repeat, and it was an experience, not just reading that,
Mm-hmm.
that first book on the Bible.
Right.
It opened up something else for me experientially. But
Mm-hmm.
nevertheless, until just a few years ago, Rhonda, I've been approaching all of this as a scientist,
Mm-hmm.
doing, aside from my own experience when I was a teen,
Yes.
in the streetcar with the sort of a form of telepathy in a sense. I went on at McGill University and actually did a master's degree thesis
Mm-hmm.
on very tightly controlled experiments on telepathy, which were also extremely successful, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And up until a few years ago, that was still my main way of looking at things. As I said, I am a medical doctor. I still work as a
Mm-hmm.
psychotherapist in particular. In my coaching work, I sometimes use the expression, I do brain-based coaching, because
Okay.
from understanding how the brain works, teaching people, there are things you can do. We're not given a owner's manual, but I can teach
Mm-hmm.
people
Mm-hmm.
different ways they can get the best performance, so to speak, out of their brain. Although, as you know, in the book more broadly, I say the brain too is only part of the picture, because the brain is a physical thing. It's part
Right.
of what's out there. And we've had scientifically this assumption that what's out there is all there really is that matters, and that the physical brain is the source of our mind, our consciousness. But that's not correct. There's
No.
actually, and this is, I know, dramatic when I say this, but I mean it.
Mm-hmm.
There's no evidence whatsoever, zero, that the brain produces consciousness. None.
None.
All we have is correlational data, meaning
Mm-hmm.
if we alter the brain physically in some ways, there's an alteration of someone's potential experience or what they can do with their body in terms of external behavior. But correlation is not causation.
Mm-hmm.
Just because you can hear a program on a radio, and if you accidentally drop that radio and break it, you haven't destroyed the program that you were hearing on that radio. Any other radio will pick up the same program.
Mm-hmm.
So the brain is like a selective receiver that way.
Mm-hmm.
But Pete, so up until a few years ago, continuing to work on this scientific perspective, testing things out, not taking things just on faith or because of peer pressure, and thinking that ultimately perhaps we'll understand the, extra abilities, powers of our mind through brain science, because there's been a lot of things we have been learning in the last few years of brain science, which we have technology now that allows us to see the brain functioning, like fMRI imaging, for example, in real time. But then about 3 years ago, I was invited to make a keynote presentation to the annual conference of a group of therapeutic touch practitioners on the Bible, laying on of hands. And I was honored by the invitation, and to honor it professionally, my ethics, I did a very, very deep dive back into the parapsychological literature, into the latest modern research on quantum mechanics and physics, deeply again into comparative religions, deeply into history of shamanistic, indigenous, beliefs and practices. You saw the books,
Yes.
how wide the scope was. It was phenomenally wide.
Yes.
And then something unexpected happened to me. Coming back to the experiential side, suddenly I experienced, this was not expected and not welcomed at the time. I suddenly did a 180 degree flip of my understanding of reality. So up to this time, I'm thinking still, buying into, in part, the materialist reductionist paradigm of reality, that it's material that's out there, knowing there's more, but still mostly thinking, okay, but it's physical, it's out there. And then suddenly I realized that although in parapsychology, it seems to be a weak science, they have to be in a defensive position in terms of, well, why aren't more people doing this? Or why aren't there more publications in respected journals? Or why even can't you repeat your results, in a reliable way? So they've been on the defensive as a weaker science. I suddenly realized that the evidence for consciousness, including parapsychological phenomena, but not just limited to it, was actually much greater than that for an external outer physical reality. In fact, I came to realize that the truth of the reality was consciousness comes first. We call this the primacy of consciousness. And we dream up the material world. The brain does not produce the mind dreams up the brain. So it was a profound shift 3 years ago. And I realized this notion of material reality, it's a metaphysical fiction. We've been led to believe that it's true. It's not true.
Yes.
And that's pretty heavy. But in our world right now, politically, there's such different ideologies where, other people have no sympathy understanding of the other positions. And we're seeing this, all over the world in various ways, whether it plays out in dirty politics or actual, unfortunately, war, as we're experiencing in the world right now. Similarly with religions, many people who believe in their faith believe that the one they were just born into, fortunately, is the only right one. And everyone else has the wrong one, or worse, they're damned. And what I found was, when I went deeply into all of these areas, the core of all world religions is the same message. We've just distorted it, like the childhood party line game, if you ever played that one. So I came to a whole different understanding. And when I was younger, I would have called myself an agnostic if you would have asked me, what's your religious belief, or do you believe in God? Because I knew, well, first of all, I was still living in this material world, even though I had some experiences. And I did not, I'll admit emotionally, I did not like the idea of my life being controlled by some powerful entity, up there.
Right.
As a kid, I just rebelled against that notion. I don't want to be controlled. Most kids wouldn't even think of such things, but I was. So I really couldn't call myself an atheist, though, because I knew that was a logical contradiction. You'd have to be God to be an atheist. How can you say, I say, no, there's no God, unless you are God, right? Which is interesting, going back to that now, in terms of that self may have been a clue. So I called myself an agnostic, and I didn't go around, in a militant way, but that's how I thought of myself. I don't know. I want to see the evidence. And now I know. And there is God. And all of this is from God. And we've made such a mess of what we've been given. And still yet could have. It's a very narrow window of opportunity to save ourselves. I know, the Bible and various times people have talked in previous years, end
Mm-hmm.
times. These are the end times right now.
Mm-hmm.
But strangely enough, there's this window of opportunity. We're on the very edge. Some people call this the great turning. It's
Okay.
not at all guaranteed we're going to get through this. And it won't just happen. No one's going to do it for us. But if we wake up, and I put my book out as I called it a global wake-up call.
A global
We
wake
wake
up
up out of our sort of dreamlike state and realize no one is going to come from the outside to save us. We have to do this ourselves. The only way out, as I say in the book, is in. You've got to go into yourself, into your intuition, into your heart wisdom. And then you also need to connect and collaborate with people in a different way. We're all in this together, even in a very different way, not speaking metaphysically, but the famous architect and philosopher, Buckminster Fuller, came up with this notion of spaceship Earth. So we have to think of ourselves on this Earth planet. We're all like on a spaceship in sterile outer space. And so we have to share our provisions. We have to make sure we, dispose of our garbage, so to speak, properly, and so on. And that was just intellectual sense, how we have to cooperate. But on a spiritual level, even more powerfully, we don't have much time. Again, it's so painful to me how fast things are deteriorating. And I'm desperate just to wake people up. And my book was designed not to entertain anyone. It's not for profit. I actually funded it through my retirement savings. And I've given up a tremendous amount of income and savings to produce this. I'm just desperate to help people wake up, and not in a way, again, of believing necessarily in me or anyone else. I want to wake them up. I want them to become more conscious and aware. And when they are, they'll feel the connection. They'll see the light ahead as opposed to the looming darkness.
And I know that when we speak about ego, and people, there's a lot of people that don't understand that. They don't realize that chatter in their head is ego. They don't realize that they have an existence other than the roommate in their head.
Yeah.
And that we have, what is it, like 80,000 thoughts every day. And each day we have almost the same thoughts. And because we're listening to our ego. And so it's difficult to make that journey to the heart or to consciousness, because I remember that people would say to me, Howard, and I read it in books, look inside. You need to go inside. And I'm like, where do I look? Even, a longtime author, that he would say, get up in the morning with a cup of coffee and go inside, and that's where your gold is. But I didn't know where to look. And I don't think I'm any different than anybody else.
No, you're not.
Where you're on a journey and you don't know where to look. And the thing is, you look in your heart, you breathe into your heart, because that's where your true essence of your being is. Yeah. And I think that when you get in touch with yourself at that level, where you can actually feel your cells in your body, I think then you come into a huge conscious awareness. And it's very tender, but when you get to that point, you can then court your soul for direction.
Yes.
Because a lot of people don't even know that they have a soul, and that's what their emotions are from.
I know. They just think we're a biological form of a computer, in a sense. And, our society, our culture is getting more and more modeled on how computers work, and reducing more and more our own interaction, because you're now talking to voicemail or you're texting, as opposed to, a real human being who isn't just, controlled by an algorithm. And we're going along with that, like these, devices, these smartphones, for example. I say they're getting smarter and smarter, but they're making people stupider and stupider.
Yes.
We're losing, so many of our abilities. In my book, coming back to, as I said, I try not to just explain and prove about how reality works, but I also try to give experiences for people, practices.
Yes,
so
you
coming
do,
back to what you asked me. So, for example, if we intentionally pay more attention, looking into people's eyes. It's hard to do it on a screen and this, Zoom age now, as we do it virtually. But when you have that chance in the outside world, in everyday life, to look at people in the eyes, even if they're strangers, or when you're talking, where you're more aware, there's that, pinnacle expression, the eyes are the windows of the soul.
Yeah.
There's actually a very long tradition in tantric yoga about soul gazing through the eyes. So that's I don't want to call it so much a quick way, but that's a good way, in a fairly quick way, to connect more deeply with others. Back to what you said about the heart. I have a whole section, as you know, on the heart, and the intelligence of the heart. And again, scientifically, as well as, the mystical descriptions of such. And so one of the other exercises in the book is to try to, as you put it, put your awareness more in your heart area, the left chest area.
Yes.
Where you can actually sort of feel, it's hard to put this in words, that area in your sensory system, as opposed to intellectually just thinking, I'm just concentrating. You actually feel a little more sense of awareness there.
It's a big difference in that, isn't there? It sounds like you could just say that in a short sentence, but oh my goodness, there's a big journey there.
And then when you're choosing to relate to someone, aside when I said the eye contact, coming from your heart, it's a whole other level. For one thing, there's compassion.
Yes.
And I would say connection, even on the spiritual realm, when you come from your heart. Similarly, if you're facing some important decision and you don't know what to do, what's the right thing or what's the safe thing, go with your heart, reflect on it. How's it feel in that part of your body? It's weird, but it really helps. Right. Another exercise that I give to formally, because for many people these are challenges, is proper way of meditating, because there's so much misinformation about meditation, and there too you have what seems so many different competing schools, and there's like competing religions, right? But there are some essential guidelines which I give in the book, and want to just to jump ahead real quickly in terms of, so how do people become more aware of the greater within? So I like the Buddhist example of thinking of our thoughts and feelings like clouds passing in the sky. So on one level, at times the clouds are there, and sometimes they're darker, and sometimes they cover the entire sky. But nevertheless, no matter what you see, it's temporary. They will eventually move. And if you start relating to your feelings, back to ego that way, okay, this is what I feel now, but that's just what I feel right now. If I don't attach to it, and they talk about non-attachment, then I can be free of that or go beyond it. Like if someone, for example, even simply, wants to diet, which is a huge challenge for people. Most Americans are overweight. And if they looked at it that way, okay, so I have a feeling, a temptation of eating, but it's just a feeling, a temptation. I don't have to. It's not that my body will collapse if I don't have that food I desire right now. And if I direct my mind into something else, perhaps in just a few minutes more, I won't even feel desire for it. And I'll feel better. I didn't succumb and eat more than I should have, or, take junk food or whatever it might be. So if we learn to, again, detach, or as they say in Buddhism, non-attachment, you're aware. It's not that you stop your awareness, but you're not so attached, not so fixed to it. And as you do that, you're opening to what I call the greater spaciousness within.
Right.
Even in meditation practice itself, and where we work a lot with breathing in most meditation traditions, it's the space between your breaths. That's the sweet spot where you go deeper.
Yeah.
Like going from, let's say, swimming on the surface of the water to diving under, the water.
Right. It sure is. I am totally lost in this conversation with you. You are listening to the Rhonda Grant Show right now, whose podcast is being treated with digital audio health by my sponsor, Syntrek. And I am speaking today with Howard Eisenberg, who is the author of Dream It to Do It. How may people reach out to you and purchase this book? You have a website that you spoke about?
Yeah, the best way to obtain my book is through online retailers. So here in Canada, Chapters, Indigo, Amazon around the world. It's not in bookstores. You can order it through a bookstore as a special order, but the easiest way to get it is definitely online, both for the print versions of it. There's also an ebook and now the audiobook too.
Yeah, the audiobook is really good. So that's on Audible.
And other platforms as well.
And
iTunes.
yes, that's right. Yeah, sure it is. And so we've talked quite a bit about your calling and being called and not having a choice. I mean, this is your life. And which is amazing. There's so many people that have not even are not in touch enough with themselves to know what their calling is. And there's no limit on when you have to find out where you're being called to. But one of the things that I like to ask is that, do you feel like you've been called? But you've answered that for us for sure. But the other is, what extraordinary discovery have you found in your life?
I don't know that I could give you a simple answer to that one. The revelation, I'll call it that, about 3 years ago, that the common assumption, again, the reality out there is a metaphysical fiction. The real reality is within. I mean, that's the really biggest experience, insight, most important awareness I think I've had in my life.
And it's so profound. I can't wait to listen to it again.
Going from, as I said, trying to be an intellectually aware and logically minded person, thinking that as a younger person that I had to be an agnostic because I was aware that there were so many different religions, like which was the right one. I already had as a kid that awareness, like they can't all be right because they're many were mutually exclusive. And plus not, say, wanting to be controlled. So it was quite a flip for me, as I say, at 108 degrees 3 years ago, to realize the fiction we've all bought into, which is so convincing, it's still not real. And what we have been forgetting in our cultural histories all over the world is the religious teachings. And they're not just, well, when people didn't know better, that's what they thought. They have been distorted through time, through egos. But I go back to the essence, and there's a concept in telecommunications called signal to noise ratio. When you want to send a signal, some information, and if you have what's called a noisy channel, let's say a bad internet connection.
Yes.
One way of dealing with that in a meaningful way is to send the message repeatedly. So the errors, let's say, or the gaps cancel out. So when I took that model, the signal to noise ratio, to the different world religions, and I looked at what's in common to them all, what doesn't cancel out. And I found yes, that's true. So I think what I've come up with, and no one has said otherwise, it's proof of God. It's not just the teachings that there is a God, it's proof. And people can experience themselves in that book with some of the exercises I give them.
Right. Oh, they sure can.
Yeah. It's one I know I suggested at the beginning of the book, for people who are dealing with some mental psychiatric problems, probably not to read such a book on their own unless they're advised. I mean, many therapists are advising their patients to read it, but I still think if someone is knowing they're having problems with their grip of reality or emotional regulation, and they're in therapy or counseling, to first, check it's an appropriate book for them. It's very powerful.
It is very powerful. And that's a good point, because you need to be grounded in order to investigate these types of things, for sure. I've so enjoyed our conversation today. You're a brilliant man, and I love what happened to you 3 years ago. And I can't wait to listen to the podcast so that I can listen to that part of it again. Well, I'll listen to all of it, but it really took me off guard because I live at this level too, and I'm learning everything and anything I can about this. But that really, really struck me. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Rhonda Grant Show. I am looking forward to having more discussions with you, Howard.
Thank you so much, Rhonda.
Theme song for the Rhonda Grant Show, Sun on the Water, is composed and performed by my friend John Park Wheeler. This is Rhonda Grant with the Rhonda Grant Show, author of Magical Forces Within, Extraordinary Discoveries in an Ordinary Life, inviting you to look for the magical forces within yourself today and every day. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for tuning in to the Rhonda Grant Show with your host, Rhonda Grant. If you would like to find out more information about Rhonda and her upcoming guests and the work that she does, go to her website, rhondagrantauthor.com. That's rhondagrantauthor.com.
Digital audio health by Syntrek.